the show, Ridhiman Balaji, and we are talking about sweatshops and labor exploitation and its relationship to Marx and other things. Actually, this conversation is based largely off of an article you wrote for the Business and Professional Ethics Journal, Sweatshops and Exploitation, a critical analysis of scholarly debate. But we're going to go into it a little more in detail. Now, I link the anti-sweatshop movement with both liberals and sometimes third worldist Marxists. But I often find the term to be very loosely and incoherently employed. So let's get into it. What is a sweatshop and what is its historical context? Like, why do they exist and why do we deal with it at all?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. Um, yeah, so the term sweatshop is actually a pejorative. Um, Sweatshops, I think, best should be viewed as a method of production, method of producing commodities. They're an offshoot of what's called the factory system, which is an offshoot of the putting out system. Putting out system basically is kind of like home production, and then factory system is factories, like production in factories. So the sweating system is basically um, it emerged during the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, and it has kind of like a bunch of features, like for example, the piece rate method of payment, which is kind of like you're not getting paid uh, at the hourly rate, you're getting paid according to how much physical quantities of goods you're producing. So that's one kind of feature. The other feature is that obviously, poor working conditions. Um, Child labor is kind of very prevalent. And then you have a lot of subcontracting of work, which means that you often have like groups of people which are given a task, and this is still kind of the way it works in, let's say, Bangladesh, where you have a garment industry, but a lot of the work is subcontracted to groups, and then you have kind of like children working alongside your mom or your dad, and yeah, so that's kind of an overview.
One of the things I noticed when reading your piece that something I hadn't thought about with sweatshops is that piecework does two things. It mimics the artisan system that was prior to capitalism formally, but also puts it in an industrial context, right? So,
Hmm.
and this creates a way, um, a way of exploiting labor that is different than traditional free labor when there's a wage, because the wage here is more piece per, you get paid
Yeah,
per unit produced.
yeah. It
This
was
is more
actually
petty
it's
proprietor stuff.
interesting to look at kind of the history of the piece wage, because this was actually a way of underpaying workers,
Mm-hmm.
because prior to the minimum wage, the piece rate was the most common form of payment, and uh, people would oppose, um, kind of capitalists would oppose the implementation or the transition from piece rate to the minimum wage, because they would say it would increase the cost of labor. So it was actually a way of underpaying workers.
So treating workers in a factory section like they're petite bourgeois artisans actually has consequences, and that leads to underpayment. And
Yeah.
what I find somewhat interesting, and I don't think they're the same. I don't want people to think they're the same. Is this was an early capitalist exploitation thing. Marx talks about it as kind of the ideal capitalist exploitation
Hmm.
mechanism, and I forgot if it's capital volume 1 or 2, but ideal for the capitalist. That is not ideal for anybody else.
Yes.
Um, but I have thought about how the gig economy and using contract work to approximate something like a piece rate is
Mhm.
similar, but it still can't reach that kind of level of exploitation that you see in sweatshops.
No, the gig work, that's an interesting kind of comparison. The gig work is basically you're basically classified as an independent contractor. Uh,
Mm.
More of a way of kind of avoiding affiliation with labor unions. Um, but you are still getting paid at the hourly rate, so it's not quite the same. But yeah.
So so it's more, the gig work is basically more of a way of getting around uh, labor regulations, and
Mm,
a relatively unregulated market,
right.
or a market with no unions, um, where there's no set like work week or whatever, it's not as necessary. But if there's no regulations, usually, and no strong sectoral union bargaining, you usually have one or the other.
Hmm.
Um, it seems pretty clear that you're not going to get gig work. You're going to get piece rate pay, so it's not a whole
Yeah.
lot better.
Hmm.
Um, so
Yeah. The other thing that's kind of maybe we can talk about is the fact that the term sweatshops isn't really used um, by academic economists. It's because of like the moral connotations behind of it.
mm,
The term that's used is called something called the informal economy. So maybe we can talk about that.
I do know that that's used. I've always been slightly confused by the use of informal economy for sweatshops, because there is there are other things that like Marxist proper would call like lumpen markets or whatever, that also are sometimes used in the category of informal economy, and they're not sweatshop conditions. It's more just like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
gray market
Uh,
stuff
right.
in black.
Right.
Mhm,
Yeah. So I guess maybe yeah. In the informal uh, there's two things. There's the informal enterprise, and then
mhm,
there's informal employment. And so when you talk about informal enterprises, that encompasses a wide range of things, including kind of your household firm, um, where it's you have production going on within the household.
mhm,
So, for example, in India, you'll find a lot of households that are both farms and households, and so that kind of like blurs the line between what is a sweatshop, because in those enterprises you still have child labor. Your family is sending the child to work in the farm. You have poor working conditions, but it's not what you would think about when you think of sweatshops, because when you think of sweatshops you think of like people working in factories. So that kind of complicates the discussion. The other issue is that you have informal employment. And the important thing to note is that you can have informal employment within formal uh, enterprises. And so that's another kind of big issue.
mhm. So informal employment here includes sweatshops, but may also include family production.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, wet shops are generally a flashpoint. Usually, the only people who defend them are libertarians. Although every once in a while, something weird will happen, like Matthew Iglesias will argue that they're progressive or something.
Yeah.
um, uh,
I mean,
they
you
are.
have kind of like
Good.
your bleeding heart libertarian types
Mm,
who justify sweatshops on social justice grounds, and they give it that kind of progressive veneer.
yeah, Iglesias, who I don't think is a breeding heart libertarian, but is like some ways the most craven of progressive liberals,
Hmm.
will sometimes argue that sweatshops are like a necessary evil for the development of productive capacity in developing world countries. So
Yeah,
it's
that is kind of the Zwolinsky and Powell position.
mhm,
I'm not sure if you know who they are, but yeah, that is kind of like they're basically arguing that they're a necessary aspect of a country's developmental process, which is an interesting position to take, but because it doesn't really explain then why sweatshops persist in the developed world, quote unquote developed world. I mean, we still have sweatshops in the U.S., quote unquote sweatshops in the U.S., right? Um,
Can we
for
talk
com-
about what you? Because I think that would surprise people. What do we mean by that? Like, I don't disagree with you, but
well,
what's an example
the
of the entry shut shops in the U.S.?
yeah, so if you look at kind of the ILO reports,
Mm-hmm.
uh, India, for example, 70 to 80% of the economy is informal sector. China, 50-60%. The US is 10 to 15%. Okay, so significantly lower, but sweatshops still persist in the US. So, that could range from kind of like your, kind of like your abusive factory type situation to household production, which is what we would call self-employment, right? So, um, yeah. So again, if it's a necessary stage, then why do they persist in the developed world?
That's an interesting point. One thing I would ask then, I think the informal economy part of it confuses people because on one hand, when we think of sweatshops, people think of big, usually something like the way Marx talked about it, honestly, garment production or small, small, small commodity production, something small for the market. We think of large warehouses of workers, which is probably not always true, but it was at one point. And we think of um, child labor and maybe subcontracted labor supply, right?
Mm-hmm,
So, and I think all those things are actually fairly true of traditional sweatshops, but they wouldn't be obvious in the United States. The sweatshops don't look the same way now. And I think you're right that a lot of it gets hidden in stuff like the rules that relax labor restrictions on family businesses and in-house production, right?
yeah.
Um,
And I mean,
uh,
you still have child labor in the US.
mhm.
Like, it's not like super prevalent. It's not like to the same degree to in as in India, but there's all sorts of like individual stories that you can find on the internet. Okay, so and so meat factory was employing children, and
Right. And
they get
we've
fined.
seen red states literally start to change their child labor restriction laws, and some
Precisely.
just removing them.
Yeah.
Um, so like most industrial production, this starts out in Great Britain, right?
Hmm.
Like it
Hmm.
actually starts there. It makes its way over to the US, and then it's still fairly common in the developing world,
Hmm. Hmm.
particularly in Southeast Asia, I think, and parts of Africa. Although,
Oh yeah, in Africa, I mean, you'll have like 90% of the economy is informal.
um, one of the things that this hit me though, I was surprised how much of it was still going on in China. So,
Yes,
like,
but it's much better in China relative to say India or Africa, but
mhm.
it's still 50 to 60%, which is kind of like it's still quite a bit.
um, so we talked a little bit about the methodology the ILO uses. For those of you who don't know, what is the ILO?
The ILO is the International Labor Organization, and kind of like one of the main branches of the UN. You
Mm-hmm.
have the ILO, the WTO, and then I'm forgetting the third one. But the ILO is responsible for um, kind of production related issues, labor issues. The trade related issues are fall under the purview of the World Trade Organization, but labor issues fall under the purview of the ILO. And yeah, the ILO has a very sophisticated methodology for classifying production, productive units.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something called the Hussman's matrix, and this is all getting technical now, but yeah, there's a big literature on the informal economy, the ILO, that type of thing.
So, I mean, this tells you where the UN and the capitalist government's interests are because you hear about the World Trade Organization all the time. You hardly ever hear about the ILO unless you are actually in the global labor studies. Um, so I imagine the process of formalizing informal economy, which is the move from piece rate into some kind of more steady wage,
Hmm.
and also more formal points of accounting. Because the other thing about this is effectively day labor. You show up, you do production, you get paid for it by piece.
And
Uh,
actually, just on that point, in many cases, for example, in Bangladesh, you don't get paid until 3 months down the line. So you don't even get paid. Um,
wow.
unpaid labor is this is a big issue. And what are you gonna do? You have no other choice. 3 months is kind of like the average, 3 to 6 months. That's what it was like in Great Britain too, by the way, during the Industrial Revolution.
Right. I mean, the weekly or monthly paycheck was actually a fight
Hmm.
for people
Hmm.
who don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Capitalists prefer to pay day labor wages, but pay them in large lump sum. Uh, and people might wonder why they want to do that, but because you're like, well, they're going to pay the same amount every day. But I'm like, that gives them time to accumulate surplus, and it can leverage the difference of value between when something is made and when
Hmm.
you pay it out. So that's why time is really important in figuring this stuff out for those of you who
Hmm.
don't study this. So,
And yeah, just on the topic of formalizing
mhm.
kind of the informal economy, that's a very kind of complicated issue. I haven't looked at it too much, but there's a uh, number of reasons why the informal economy persists. Bottom line, though, is that it's very expensive, and it's a whole political issue. There's two things, as I mentioned. There's the uh, formalizing workers, organizing them into unions. That's one issue. The other issue is formalizing enterprises, and governments typically tend to prioritize um, formalizing enterprises because you get more tax revenue from if you integrate them into the formal economy. So big issue.
Hmm. Now, those people who grow up on modern monetary theory will probably wonder why do these governments care about tax revenues?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't accept the whole idea that taxes aren't necessary for expenses. I mean taxes. I think they're. I mean, maybe it's true for you know, the U.S., which is I forget the term that's used, but um,
A currency sovereign
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. That
currency sovereigns suspiciously all look like the British Empire. Like it's
yeah,
actually kind of interesting, with the exception of Japan. And
but it certainly doesn't apply to poor countries. Uh,
yeah, it
and
doesn't. MMT requires a highly developed economy with the ability to compel market capture outside of it,
mhm,
right? So you either have to be productive enough or have enough guns, and so these small countries can't do that. They don't have I mean, literally, they don't have the physical resources by themselves to operate semi-autarkically like that.
right.
So they do have to get tax revenues. Often they're getting tax revenues. I mean, some of these countries are getting tax revenues not even in their local currency. I mean, like
Yeah.
there's some countries that take the shit in USD, or whatever. It's interesting though to think about this. Why did formalizing the economy become big in the British and European systems? It does seem to me
Yeah.
that
So that's
isn't obvious.
that's an interesting uh, point. Uh, Things got so bad in Great Britain that the British Parliament eventually picked it up uh, and commissioned several studies. Um, and then it became a very kind of like a political issue. It got picked up by the labor movement, and and they kind of agitated for better working conditions, better pay, that type of thing. So that is kind of why, and same thing in the U.S., but not to the same degree. But yeah, that is kind of why it's reduced. It's been minimized, but it's still there, but not to the same degree.
So when did the process of formalization really kick up in the UK? Was that the late 19th century, or is it later than that?
Yes, I talk about it in the paper. I don't remember it offhand, but yes, I think that seems correct. Yeah,
Right. So
but it was a very slow process.
right. I always find it interesting that when we talk about industrialization, we always talk about like the primary model, because the first thing that was industrialized was garment production, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then it spread like wildfire to all sorts of production. But it is interesting today that I always talk about. If you want to look where the shittiest working conditions are in the most exploited parts of capital, in the industrial capital sector are, you want to follow garment production. Even still, like, where is garments produced? Like Bangladesh. Conditions of
Bangladesh.
capitalism in Bangladesh are terrible. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
just Bangladesh, but
And then you can also kind of think about uh, uh, what the conditions must have been like during COVID-19, right? Because that's kind of another layer of uh, impoverishment that they have to deal with that we don't. I mean, we're here kind of like debating lockdowns, kind of all of that, but then they have to like work under COVID conditions.
hmm. So the first anti-sweatshop movement comes out of the British Parliament, but the modern anti-sweatshop movement is way modern. Um,
Yeah, so that's true. So criticism of sweatshops, I mean that has a long history, but what we think about is what we might call the modern anti-sweatshop movement. That has a relatively recent origin, um, late '80s, early '90s, um, in the U.S. at least, and that has to do with the kind of there was significant institutional pressure from the AFL-CIO. So yeah, maybe should I talk about that now?
yeah, please do.
Yeah. So the AFL-CIO, there was a person named Jeff Bollinger who basically went to Congress and started to raise awareness about Indonesia in particular. Indonesian footwear factories, Nike factories, that type of thing. And he after that coverage of sweatshops in Indonesia and Vietnam increased significantly, and you started to hear a lot more about child labor. So here I'll just read something. Media coverage of global sweatshops increased, 300% increase in the number of articles regarding child labor. 400% increase in the number of articles focusing on sweatshop activities. There was a documentary also, Nike Sweatshops Behind the Swoosh.
Yeah, I remember this. I think I saw this actually. Must
Yeah,
have been in the 90s, right?
yeah, in the 90s. And and then there's a switch. There's a person named John Sweeney who gets elected to the AFL-CIO, and he applies a lot of pressure. He uh, um, he makes a lot of effort to uh, kind of aggressively campaign against sweatshops by targeting uh, university students. And so he with the help of the AFL-CIO, there was the formation of something called the United Students Against Sweatshops, and that's a kind of a very that organization plays a significant role. And so you think about the name United Students Against Sweatshops, you think, okay, this must be kind of like a youth led movement that emerged organically. but actually there was significant institutional backing
Mm-hmm.
that led to the formation of this organization. And then the USAS, they start to advocate for policies like the adoption of codes of conduct, um, you know, and things like attaching workers' rights to trade agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so in essence, there was a this switch in administration led to a deliberate effort to target college campuses, and Indonesia in particular was targeted. And so, what was the impact of that? Well, actually, so both due to external pressure and kind of pressure within Indonesia, there was a significant hike in minimum wage. So the minimum wage in Indonesia quadrupled in nominal terms and doubled in real terms. So that's between 1989 and 1996. So significant increase in minimum wage. And the way that materialized was because the AFL-CIO, due to the AFL's pressure from the AFL-CIO, the U.S. government basically threatened to revoke special tariff privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in order to avoid that, they hiked their minimum wage. And that's kind of where the academic literature starts. They're kind of like criticizing these efforts by the um, AFL-CIO, um, but they're criticizing United Students Against Sweatshops. So it makes it seem like they're kind of like criticizing students, naive students, that type of thing. But they're actually criticizing lobbying efforts by the AFL-CIO.
So why did the AFL-CIO suddenly care about this other than people being exposed
That's
to
a
the
good question.
production?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, it seems like, they're advocating for workers' rights. What's wrong with that? Why who opposes that? But actually there's a kind of ulterior motive. Actually this is a form of hidden protectionism, which is something that people don't really recognize. And so the whole campaign to attach labor provisions to trade agreements is a form of uh, protectionism, meaning that it's a way of making U.S. exports more competitive relative to exports from, let's say, Indonesia. So, for example, Indonesia is forced to pay their workers a higher wage. Indonesian exports become more expensive relative to US exports. So US exports increase in sales, better for US workers. Okay. Ambiguous effect for workers in the third world. Okay. Some people get uh, laid off, they don't work anymore, but other workers, they work for a better pay. But so it has an ambiguous effect. But the other thing to note here is that these there's two things. One, on the one hand, uh, you have these types of provisions are almost always directed at countries that don't have a favorable political relationship with the U.S. So, for example, countries like Syria, because it's opposed to Israel, China, Cuba. Okay, those countries are subjected to these provisions, but countries that have positive relations aren't really up to the held uh, up to the held up to the same standard. They're not held to the same standard. And the other point is that, well, actually, there's significant labor exploitation within the U.S. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's you can think about, like, let's say, prison labor. Okay, the U.S. criticizes China for, let's say, slave, quote unquote, slave labor in cotton farms in Xinjiang. But if you look at, let's say, farms in Louisiana, which are producing organic goods, they're the largest exporters of organic goods. They're made under very similar conditions. So there's a kind of a double standard there.
Yeah, I mean, the use of prison labor was actually probably higher 20 years ago, but it's still a huge part of the industrial sector in the United States, particularly in like agrarian labor. Um, and that's because the constitutional amendment that prevents slavery has an exemption clause for prisoners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Although most states do pay prison labor something, it's usually to the tone of like $1 an hour or less. So it's a very
Yeah.
exploitative labor system.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
The other thing that I want to mention really quickly is the when you include these labor provisions in trade agreements, one of the things that it does is that it effectively discourages capital investment uh, in countries like such as Cuba. Let's say Cuba is routinely accused of employing quote unquote forced labor,
mhm,
and so what that does is that it discourages. Well, I mean, there's an embargo as well, but it also kind of discourages capitalists from investing in Cuba or let's say China, right?
mhm.
So that's also important to recognize. So it's depriving them of very necessary capital, is my point.
Right. So this is why it's ambiguous. There might be some workers who benefit under these regimes, but you're going to have layoffs, and this is going to be used as a means of trade and maybe even labor arbitrage that suppresses wages in the developing world.
Hmm.
Sometimes raises them, uh, but it's going to slow down capital accumulation.
Hmm.
Um, and it seems, one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading your paper, and your paper doesn't mention this, but the prior real pushback on this was like in the East Asian garment industry, like in South Korea, in the 60s and 70s, where they were really subject to tariffs. And one of the things South Korean chaebols, which are these mega firms, did is they established sweatshops in Bangladesh to get
Mm.
around the tariffs. So and that was going on in the 70s. So it seems to me that part of the protectionism the AFL-CIO was pushing, and I don't want to say that it was totally cynical. Like I do think they actually did care about some
Yeah.
workers' issues, but that it is interesting the timing here, that switching from direct protectionism
Yeah.
and tariffs to indirect protectionism and tariffs is partly responsive to develops of capital in Asia moving to subcontracting their labor to Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
making the direct tariffs of specific countries and regions a little bit less effective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's kind of the important thing to note is that they didn't explicitly adopt a protectionist orientation. It was very indirect, but the net effects are arguably the same.
so another interesting debate around this is the debate on minimum wage versus living wage that
Yeah.
seems to emerge at this time. Now, when we talk about piecework and sweatshops, they're not even really making a true minimum wage because they're getting
No.
paid per item.
Hmm.
Um, but
Like like 2 cents a piece, 3 cents a piece.
yeah, um, but it was kind of astounding to me. Like when I was in Mexico, not a lot of people made the actual minimum wage. The actual minimum wage was something like, I don't know, $20 a day or something. It was for no, it wasn't even that. Um, it was very very low. Actually, I should.
Hmm.
So I was being optimistic at $20 a day. Um, there are two minimum wages in Mexico, and I lived near the border.
Hmm.
So I was actually in the northern border minimum wage zone, which was about $22 a day now. It's 374.89 Mexican pesos a day, which is about 22 bucks.
Hmm.
That's higher than when I lived there. And the general minimum wage for the entire country is 448.93 Mexican pesos, which is about $15 a day. Now, that's not as bad as anywhere in Southeast Asia or like Africa, but it is still remarkably low because while things are significantly cheaper in Mexico, you do need to make probably about 20K to approximate an American middle class lifestyle, in so much of that is possible.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was just gonna say the minimum wage debate gets very complicated, and because I mean you're right, like it is quite low, but the thing to keep in mind is that the minimum wage isn't the only source of income that workers have. And I'm not like, without making any judgments about whether it's too high versus too low. That's kind of an important point to keep in mind because they are getting other sources of income, and kind of the debate on the minimum wage in the U.S. There's huge literature on this. There is some evidence to suggest that the types of people who work on the minimum wage aren't necessarily on the low end of the income spectrum. So, for example, you can have a high income household uh, where you have like a teenager who is working on the minimum wage, and they're getting paid the minimum wage, but they're not necessarily on the low end of the income spectrum. So the discussion gets very complicated. It's polarized along uh, political lines, and yeah, I'm kind of neutral on it, but
yeah.
I do think it's important to recognize those issues.
Well, I was going to talk about this a little bit because the minimum wage required you to be formally employed, and that was not,
Precisely. So
uh,
yeah,
yeah,
I
go ahead.
mean that by definition, you are only getting paid if you work. At least in the formal work in the formal uh, sector, right? So if you're not working, you're not getting paid. So by definition, it's biased towards those who work.
So, and the other thing I'd like to point out, I just did some quick calculations while we were talking.
Mm,
Thank you, calculator and Google, for making that easier for me. But the minimum wage in Mexico, if you actually make the northern border minimum wage, you make the equivalent of roughly $17,000 a year, which is not great. But I want to remind you that the poverty line in the United States is $14,000 a year.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
so you would be making above the US poverty line. But you, as you said, you and I both know, it's not the only form of income for a household, and household incomes in places like Mexico are not even two family, they're more like three or four.
yeah,
And there's a lot of income on and gray and informal markets. So both gray market trading, uh, all those neat, haggle bazaars that you go to in foreign countries, those are gray market tradings.
yeah.
And
But also, like, you get a lot of like social benefits from the government,
mhm.
and your tax liability is lower if you're on the lower end of the income spectrum. Uh, so you have to consider a lot of things, not just look at the minimum wage on its own.
Well, I mean, that's even true in the US. When a lot of people
Hmm.
look at wages in the US, they'll talk about average income, but they don't even look at like the cost of benefits, the cost of additional tax burdens, etc. And as a
Yeah.
person who, as a petite bourgeois person, and I pay self-employment tax, that tax burden is not insignificant. Um,
Yeah.
it basically effectively doubles your tax rate. So now, again, I'm not here to like say pity the poor petite bourgeoisie, but it's just something to note when people talk about compensation, and the
Hmm.
different costs of compensation, and also relative goods. And one other thing that makes this very complicated is the same thing that you see in the U.S. actually is social infrastructure. varies greatly in different parts of Mexico. If you're in District Federal, what we call Mexico City, there's a pretty good infrastructure for the poor. If you're in Oaxaca, Chiapas, Michoacan, uh, that infrastructure often is not there. And if you're in like a rural peasantry place or a ranchero or something like that, there might not even be electricity for anybody.
Yep.
Like,
And
it,
just on that point, the U.S. Compared to other developed countries has a very kind of poor welfare system.
yeah.
Uh, doesn't Not as much in terms of social benefits relative to, let's say, France or Germany. Um,
Or
so
even
yeah,
the UK, as pathetic
yeah,
as that is.
yeah,
Like,
and I mean, like the healthcare situation is ridiculous, right? So
right.
that right there is like one of the biggest factors.
As a person who's gotten healthcare in the developing world, it is often still, even for poor people, proportionately cheaper. And
Yeah,
that's not even not to go off too much, but that's even true in places that don't have socialized medicine.
yeah,
It just doesn't work the way it works in the US. Um, I want to go into this a little more, though. I think it's interesting to think about this problem because your article makes it clear that there are things that people utilize that we might say, like, your paper does not say that the effects of the AFL-CIO on developing nations was all bad, like, but it's just it it's not all good, and the motivations for it. I'm sure that a lot of the activists that were recruited on college campuses non-organically were
yeah. I
very
mean, I'm sure they
sincere.
were, yeah, very sincere. Yeah, I think you're quite right. Uh, yeah, I mean, it wasn't all bad, nor was it all good. It was mixed.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, I'm sure kind of some of the activists within these developing countries wanted these provisions, but others maybe didn't. And so, like, you know, it, I think it's not fair to say that it was all negative, but I do think it's important to recognize that they, at the end of the day, they were prioritizing the well-being of American workers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that they did it was by artificially kind of um, uh, making their competition worse off by forcing them to pay, in the case of the minimum wage issue, forcing them to pay higher wages.
Right. This is why Sean Fain of the UAW is not asking the United States to drop its unnecessarily high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, for example.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and that can't be said to be all out of the goodness of the UAW's heart. Like, they have their own interest at hand. This is also occurring in Europe right now, and even bigger things, bigger degrees, because Europeans have more trade agreements with China that aren't subject to tariffs, but they're terrified of the EV market. Like, German
Hmm.
automakers are
Yeah,
absolutely
yeah, yeah.
uh, concerned and want to push back. Uh, and if they can if they can push back and make it look like it's good for everybody, they will. I also think this is why labor internationalism is both very important but very hard to do, because, like, we look at the anti-sweatshop movement from the 90s, and that's like, that looks like labor internationalism, but its downstream effects are not always great.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. That's yeah. So that's yeah. Like you know, it you're advocating for higher labor standards. What's wrong with that? Except they're doing it within a framework. Like for example, they're advocating for attaching higher labor standards with liberalizing tariffs,
mhm.
and that I think uh, is much more problematic than just advocating for higher labor standards.
Right. Um, it is interesting to think about how all that works, and even something.
And it's also important to look at which countries are being targeted. Like China
Right.
is being targeted, but other
India
countries,
probably isn't.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
Brazil
Or to the
isn't right now. Like,
degree that India maybe is targeted, it's targeted in sectors that are directly competing with the US.
so we've mentioned a little bit about this as a concern for Marxists. One of the things that is an issue for modern day Marxists is they obsess over the general wage fund, but we think about it in terms of modern wage relations, right?
Hmm.
Um, and we have to remember that particularly before, when we were dealing with a lot of individual commodities that are finishable and within one factory, like a
Hmm.
garment.
Hmm.
Marx is talking about this as much as he's talking about the way we think of wages now, which is not to say he wasn't talking about the way we think of wages now. He was, but this is, even though this is the informal economy, um, this is not what like we would consider in Marxist categories lumpen labor, or I just want to make that clear, or uh, black market and gray market labor. I mean,
No.
it is kind of a gray market because it's unregulated and
Yeah, I mean it's not what you would call a crime. You can't
right,
classify it as a crime. It's the unregulated, unmonitored sectors of the economy, and that's where most of the exploitation occurs. Exploit. I'm using that term loosely here. Um, abuse, exploitation. That's where most of that occurs because they can hide it well, right?
right. So um, after Indonesia, there is an academic pushback to the anti-sweatshop movement. I did, and your article actually made this kind of clear to me because I remember when I was in high school, and it was still kind of going on in early colleges. But I'm of the age where this happened. Like I would have been in high school when a USAID stuff was at its peak.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Around the time I was graduating from college, I think this was around 2002 to 2006. That's when I started seeing all these articles that have been written in academic journals, but we're now bleeding out from the Cato Institute into newspapers
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, about why sweatshops really weren't that bad, really, and also maybe this protectionism is actually motivating a lot of this.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I guess the libertarians are kind of correct on that point. Like maybe there are some ulterior motives to consider. But yeah, I mean, that entire literature was in response to this effort, this union led effort to uh, tie increases in labor standards with trade agreements. And that's where kind of the intellectual defenses of sweatshops start to emerge. And so you have Maitland, I talk about him, who kind of like pushes back against the idea of paying workers according to a quote unquote living wage, because that's a very ambiguous category. What's a living wage? How do you determine that? That can get very complicated. Zulinski and Powell are kind of like very, very famous. You know, Zulinski, I think 2007 is where he defended on moral grounds, moral social justice grounds. Powell has a book, uh, and they often collaborate together. And yeah, that's kind of where the literature emerges.
as a side note, one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of social justice claims is because I see them, even more than Marx's claims, to be able to be used to justify pretty much any damn thing, including things that seem pretty exploitative to common people in the common sense of the term exploitation. And for those
Yeah,
of you who are wondering why Red and I are being careful about this, we're going to talk about Marxist exploitation in a little while.
yeah,
And that's very specific. It is not the same as like general exploitation.
no,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
so So I remember Powell's book around social justice. So it's like, yeah, the bleeding heart libertarians, or that's also from the time period of the libertarian,
Yeah,
type,
yeah,
where there was like a group of libertarians who are like, you know what, maybe we should be more speak to social justice concerns and even work with Democrats for a little while. They didn't last very long. It kind of faded as soon as the Bush administration was gone, but it was a thing. But a lot of their arguments around sweatshops, as I'm saying, I even heard uh, um, Zelensky and Powell were actually cited, I believe, by Matthew Iglesias. Like,
yeah, yeah. I mean, they are the ones that have developed this kind of like what's become a standard pro sweatshop uh, academic response. And actually, I think even Paul Krugman was kind of, uh, uh, you know, pushing back against the AFL-CIO efforts, that type of thing.
yeah. So let's go into Zelensky and Powell's arguments.
Sure.
In your paper, you say that not all their points are invalid or cynical. What are some of the points that you think they actually are correct on?
Well, uh, I mean, uh, they say like, for example, working in a sweatshop is a choice. Okay. I mean, okay, it's a choice. But I think we have to look at why they're making the choice, right? And um, I mean, they're making the choice to work there out of desperation. Okay, so I mean, there's a kind of a kernel of truth there. Okay, the other point that they make is that okay, they are benefiting from working in sweatshops. Okay, they're benefiting. They get paid. I mean, of course they're benefiting. Why else would they work? So okay, there's some kernel of truth in what they're saying. But kind of my main pushback, the main issue is is their treatment of Marx and how they're kind of dismissing Marx's theory of exploitation based on a misunderstanding,
Mm-hmm. Well, they
which is
seem to think it's a moral argument. Like,
yeah, that's the other issue. And I don't talk about this too much in the paper, but there's a whole sub debate about whether Marx's theory of exploitation is a moral critique.
mm,
And I think that's a complicated, maybe you can tell us what you think, but I think it's not that it's not a moral critique, but I also think it's not a moral critique. I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. I think Marx's theory of exploitation is a technical kind of political economy concept, but I do think that Marx, when he talks about labor exploitation, he does have kind of like a moral connotation
mm.
uh, embedded. So I think it's more complicated, but it's not like he's not providing like a moral critique of capitalism.
Yeah, I will say from a meta ethical standpoint, not an ethical standpoint, you have to think that what Marx is describing is wrong in some normative sense to get upset about it. Like if you're a Nietzschean and you just think that humans can exploit other people because they're, great aristocratic, Ubermensch, then Marxist appeal isn't gonna apply to you. But that's actually not even to me. I mean, using very technical terms here for my audience, but that's a meta ethical concern. The actual argument is about surplus value or surplus. We're not. Let's not. I'm not even throw the value in here because that's a messy word, as you and I talk about all the time.
Yeah.
But it's about
Maybe
surplus.
we can talk about what he means by
Right.
exploitation.
Yeah. What do you think
Uh,
Marx means by exploitation?
so the way I understand it is that he's talking about surplus labor. So what is surplus labor? Surplus labor means workers are working beyond what is necessary to produce a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I interpret M- Marxist theory of exploitation. That what makes exploitation in Marx's understanding is that workers are doing more work than what is necessary to produce a commodity. And by the way, we are talking about work in the sense of uh, work necessary to produce commodities, things that are produced and exchanged on the market.
Hmm.
Um, so that's kind of important to recognize, not just work like, let's say, uh, you're working for your boss, like working in the service sector, which, okay, that's not what Marx is talking about, but I'm not saying that's not exploitation.
Yeah, service sector gets complicated because its relationship to commodities are not obvious.
Yes.
And there's this is also true for logistics, which Marx even tries to deal with. Some of the stuff actually does come up in Capital Value too, in theories of surplus value, but for Marx, the production of the commodity requires surplus labor um, that enables the capitalist to sell the commodity on the market and get a price that is more than its cost of both fixed and variable capital. Fixed capital is all the materials that would, including machines and factory instruments and all that are used to create um, a commodity, inputs, machines, and then variable capital is primarily labor. It's labor. It's wages or piecework. Like
Yep. Yep.
so.
Yep.
Um, and the reason why it's variable is you're trying to push people to work more than they need to work, and that's a way to command more stuff from to leverage that surplus. Um,
Yeah, and I guess the issue, so that's Marx. But the issue with kind of the sweatshop defenders is that they completely misread Marx, and they make it about they introduce other concepts like fairness. Like, for example, Zulinski, he says he has a completely different way of looking at it. He says, uh, uh, he, workers, he doesn't look at it, capitalists are buying and selling workers' labor power. He says, individuals are exchanging uh, services,
right.
right? And so it's an exchange based perspective. Uh, and that exchange leads to, it generates a social surplus, and it's the distribution of that social surplus, it's the unfair distribution of that social surplus that makes it exploitative. And that raises a whole host of issue, like what's a fair, is there such a thing as a fair distribution? What is the social surplus, and so the point is that they have a completely different way of looking at exploitation, um, and that leads to kind of a whole issue of what is exploitation. Like, that's a kind of a it can be a difficult concept.
So we talked a little bit about what it means in Marx, but we also like basically these libertarians pretend that Marx's primary concern is that that's unfair or at least unequal distribution, uh, because they've never read Critique of the Goethe Program or any of the other places where Marx says that like we're not primarily or initially worried about even the uneven distribution because you need, you know, which
Yeah,
I
and
think
I mean,
surprises people. So
yeah, and I mean, Marx in the Critique of the Gothic Problem is one of the things he says. I'm paraphrasing. Uh, the bourgeois say that the world as it exists is already fair. You know what I mean?
right.
Like, the capitalist system is already fair. So it's not about fairness. Yeah, which is something that they miss completely.
Yeah, I mean, he mocks LaSalle for talking about a fair day's wage.
Hmm.
He outright mocks him.
Hmm.
Um, so it's interesting to think about that in a lot of these papers on sweatshops, the critique of Marx is either a straw man or sometimes it's not even a straw man. It's just completely wrong. It's like what they're arguing
Yeah,
against just not what Marx said at all.
and
Um,
in
Go ahead.
fairness to libertarians, I'm not defending libertarianism, but in fairness to libertarians, even kind of your Marx friendly academic like Cohen,
Mm,
he also misrepresents Marx, because I think he says exchange value is determined by socially necessary labor time. So that's wrong. That's factually incorrect. So it's not even just libertarians that get him wrong. It's
Oh
non.
yeah. For those of you who don't know, that means that he has a labor theory, and I'm very clear about this, of price,
Yeah.
which is not there are different schools of Marxists who approach this, but very few of them who still believe in labor theory of value believe in labor theory of price. And what Cohen and a lot of analytic Marxists do with this is to actually say, well, Marx is kind of right, but we need to fix these concepts. What are we going to bring in? A lot of times it's like neoclassical equilibrium economics, which is like, what? Like, that's not the case for Cohen. I'm actually not sure what Cohen brings in.
Uh, Cohen, I think I've read Cohen a little bit. I criticize him in the paper. Cohen kind of, in my, as I read him, he kind of like uh, shifts the goalpost a little bit. So, for example, in his 1979 paper, I think he says that labor theory of value and exploitation are mutually irrelevant. But then in his 1983 paper, I think he says that it's not a suitable basis for charges of exploitation. So those are two different claims. He says it's mutually irrelevant, then he says it's not a suitable basis. But then when you go into it, what does he mean by labor theory of value? He's completely kind of strawmanning Marx.
Yeah, so we agree that he kind of misreads it as a labor theory of price, which is not an uncommon misreading. He also seems to take the transformation problem at face value, which
Yeah.
is bizarre for a so-called Marxist to take at face value, because that was not even hard to get around.
Yeah.
Nor do all the people who posit it even agree on what the problem is. So he had a kind of famous debate on sweatshops. I think you mentioned this in your paper, the Coleman Holstrom debate. Can you go about like his debate a little bit? Why do we
Yeah.
care about J. Cohen other than he's popular again?
He's not debating sweatshops. He's actually debating kind of the exploitation, like whether or not Marx's theory of
Mm-hmm.
exploitation uh, is a valid like kind of theory.
Mm-hmm.
And so he basically argues that it's not. Holmstrom says, "Look, you are misinterpreting Marx. She says exactly what you're saying, that it's not a theory of prices. It's the the idea of a socially necessary labor time is meant to describe as the substance of value, not as opposed to the form of value. But
Mm-hmm.
she doesn't say this, but that's what it is. But yeah, but he doesn't get it. He kind of just repeats what he says in his previous paper, and then that's it. And which is why I'm kind of like it bothers me when you have people on the left who are kind of like expressing admiration for Cohen,
Mm-hmm.
because this person is not really defending Marx. He's a critic of Marx.
Right, and you would rather there be like you prefer your critics of Marx to be outright and direct, not people who claim to be on our side. Like I was talking about this a little bit. It's easier for me to deal with and even like debate, interlock, even grapple with, even make political compromises with someone who I realize is an explicit enemy. It's harder when the critics and stuff are within our own walls and tearing down our own conceptual apparatuses while claiming to be defending them. And that's like,
Yeah.
Cohen's most favorite book, Karl Marx's Theory of History of Defense, which turns Karl Marx into a Whig,
Mm-hmm.
because that book reads development of production as basically linear, and also as about just creating more and more stuff that we can build off of. And I'm like, that's just Whiggish history. That's all that is. And that's not what Marx thought. Um, and it's clear that that's not what Marx thought, because Cohen admits he has to bring in a bunch of other concepts from other more, less Marxist sources, everything from equilibrium economics to game theory, to make some of the stuff work. We also see this in Romer.
Romer,
We
yeah.
see this in someone I don't dislike as much as I dislike Cohen, but it comes up in Eric Olin Wright's book on class. Like
Yeah,
it's
Elster is the other one.
yeah, Elster. Um, and the analytic Marxists had influences on other groups. They had influences on both the political Marxists, that's Brenner and Ellen Macon Woods, and the World System School
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
of
mm-hmm.
Wallerstein and Arrighi, and I guess to some degree Samir Amin, who also do not use a lot of classical Marxist concepts
Yeah,
like exploitation in the same way Marx does. So it is
precisely. Yeah.
Cohen is like endemic.
Yeah.
David Harvey doesn't kind of accepts Cohen's critique of labor theory of value because he reads it as labor theory of price. And I find it very weird that people would do that as Marxists because we've been talking about how that was a bad reading when Marx was alive forward. Like it's an argument we literally been having since Marxism's been a thing, that when we say labor theory of value, we do not mean it is predictive of individual prices of commodities.
Yeah, I think I don't really talk about this in the paper, but I think the term labor theory of value is kind of like a problematic term in my opinion
Mm,
because it, first of all, it doesn't appear in either Smith, Ricardo, or Marx.
right.
Uh, for people who don't know, even Adam Smith and David Ricardo are often characterized as having a labor theory of value.
Mm,
And even if you use that term to describe Adam Smith or David Ricardo, it's not that they are directly trying to explain commodity prices. It's indirect. I'm talking Smith and Ricardo now. Like they distinguish between natural price and market prices,
mm,
and they're not trying to explain market prices, which is something people don't understand. And
mm.
maybe this suggests that they're not familiar with the things that they're criticizing. And yeah,
I don't think a lot of people know the difference between classical and neoclassical economy.
yeah,
Like, uh, and a lot of the distinctions get wiped away. Like, you're right. Like, this idea of natural versus market price, um, that's obliterated in neoclassical economics. And so when
yeah,
people approach the earlier texts, they don't seem to know what's being talked about, and that's a
yeah,
huge problem. And that's not just for Marx; that's for the people Marx is,
yeah.
interlocking with too.
And Marx makes this distinction as well: prices of production, which is more comparable to natural price and versus market price. So he's not explaining market prices; he's explaining prices of production. And just on that point about labor theory of value, this term actually originates in Bombauer.
Mm.
Uh, and Kautsky uses this term, but he's accurately describing Marx's theoretical apparatus. It's not a like people when they say this term, they're using it as a catch-all term to describe the totality of Marx's theoretical system. Uh, but once you kind of dig down into it, it doesn't effectively capture, the difference between form and substance, for example.
Mm-hmm. Why is the difference between form and substance important? This is more for my audience than me, but
Yeah. So the form, it's important to distinguish between the two because, as you mentioned, as we've been discussing, uh, uh, people often confuse the definitions for the two,
mm,
and what it ends up in a very confusing kind of critique of Marx. Except they're not criticizing Marx; they're criticizing strawmans, which is the issue with Cohen, but also libertarians. And so it's important to distinguish between form versus substance. Form meaning the appearance of value uh, um, as determined by its exchange value, and substance as in the content of the commodity um, as determined by socially necessary labor time. And people don't distinguish between the two. Um, and so they're kind of talking past each other. So it's important to distinguish. This is kind of a point that I drive home in the paper, that it's important to distinguish between the two. And yeah.
Now, just to tie this last little bit in, why is this distinction important in the discussion of sweatshops? This will be our last point.
Well, because it, it uh it's not exploitation isn't it's not that people are it's not on the basis of price.
Mm.
It's on the basis of surplus labor, which is as we mentioned, it's more uh, the work that you're doing above and beyond what is necessary. And so people, uh, if you don't distinguish between the two concepts, you're gonna think that you're gonna start from the premise that Marx had a labor theory of value, which you're gonna interpret as a price theory of price, and then you're gonna get confused. Um, so it's important to distinguish between the theoretical concepts.
Right. Because the reason, like, even in the case of sweatshops, I think it's important to get the difference in theoretical concepts. The reason why um, exploitation is more possible in sweatshops is by paying piece, you can up productivity more than you can with a standard hourly wage. Right.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. So what yeah, there's different ways of kind of increasing the degree of exploitation. There's You can pay your workers less. Uh, you can make them work more hours. You can you know deprive them of wages. Like for example, in Bangladesh, as I mentioned, like you don't get paid three months, at least 3 months. Okay, these are all ways of increasing the degree of exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in the paper, what I say is that, look, I'm not saying a Marxist theory of exploitation is the only way to conceptualize exploitation, but this is one way to do it.
And that would mean that sweatshops are pretty exploitative, not even on grounds of fairness. So
Yeah,
um, it's a pretty clear point. Well, thank you, Rid. I always like coming in and getting into this more technical side of Marx for you. What are your current projects? What are you working on?
I have a paper coming out. I have a paper that I'm working on David Ricardo,
Mm-hmm.
um, kind of how uh, his theory of foreign trade is misrepresented in economics textbook.
Mm.
And then I'm gonna be starting a book on imperialism and anti-imperialism, which is gonna take some time. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm working on.
All right. Um, imperialism and Marxism is one of the stickiest wickets. It's up there with the national question on
Yeah,
not that most Marxists think imperialism exists, but if you actually get into the nitty gritty of what people say imperialism is, Marxists actually often don't agree on their definitions on that.
yeah,
Um, like almost everybody agrees imperialism exists and is bad, but we don't all agree about what the actual mechanism of imperial force is. Is it primitive accumulation? Is it labor arbitrage? Is it
yeah. I mean, Hobson's theory of imperialism is based on underconsumption, right?
right? Exactly.
Which is
And
a
wasn't Marxist either.
yeah,
It's like proto uh
Keynesian almost.
yeah, it's like proto Keynesian. And Kautsky's theory of imperialism is very, very different from Lenin's, even though they both are based on assumptions around exploitation. They think it leads to different things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's something to deal with. It is to me one of the stickiest wickets in all of Marxism because
Yeah,
later schools redefine imperialism. So like
yeah,
what say world systems people mean by imperialism and third worldists mean by imperialism is
yeah,
different.
Yeah,
than what
dependency theory, unequal exchange, that type of thing. Yeah.
is different
Yeah.
than what earlier Marxists thought imperialism was. So I'll be looking forward to talking to you about that book. Thank you so much, Rid. Am I going to be able to link the paper in the show notes, or is it behind?
Yeah. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
It's an early version, but it should be appearing in a volume soon. But it's been accepted and it'll be published soon.
Sweet. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right.
And
And
thank you for having me.
thank you for coming on, and I look forward to talking to you again so we
Okay.
can get into the nitty gritty stuff.
Sure.
See you later.
Take care.